A few nights ago, I was grabbing a drink with a retired Japanese diplomat, a man who spent 30 years navigating the backrooms of the LDP. He was staring at a TV screen showing Prime Minister Takeiichi delivering a blistering speech about Taiwan. Beijing's response had just flashed across the bottom, a total ban on seafood and a travel advisory that had already grounded thousands of flights. You'd think he'd be worried about a diplomatic meltdown. Instead, he just took a slow sip of his whiskey and gave a dry, almost cynical chuckle. "It's perfect," he muttered. When I asked him what was so perfect about a trade war, he didn't talk about naval blockades or national sovereignty. Instead, he started scrolling through his phone, showing me reports of the Anybody But Takeiichi campaign from the LDP's own faction bosses. "The more Beijing screams," he said, "the more our own establishment can nod and say, 'We told you she was dangerous.'" It was a jarring realization. On the surface, the headlines from Kyoto News and the Asahi Shimbun show two nations on the brink of a historic clash. Takeiichi, the Japanese Trump, is the firebrand, and Beijing is the wall of fire. But as we kept talking, a different picture emerged. One where the political elites in both Tokyo and Beijing are actually following the same script. They both have the same problem, an unpredictable leader who bypasses traditional power structures. And they're both using this public friction to solve it. That sudden shift in perspective, from seeing international conflict to seeing a coordinated Pincer Movement against a populist, is what's really happening behind the noise. We're told this is a story about Japan versus China. But what if the loudest enemies in the room are actually the ones working hardest to keep the same status quo? What if the real conflict isn't between nations, but between a new wave of nationalism and the entrenched powers trying to survive it? Okay, so let's unpack this. That insight, that the conflict might actually be the mechanism of the fix, it fundamentally changes how we view international relations, especially now in this populist era.
It really does.
So our mission today is to look directly beneath those, standard geopolitical headlines, Japan versus China, and explore this fascinating possibility that the loudest, most obvious enemies in the room are, in reality, maybe unintentionally or even tacitly, collaborating.
And their shared goal is really simple when you boil it down. Preserve the existing political and economic status quo.
Right, against a common unpredictable threat. The populist leader who just doesn't play by the established rules. So this is a deep dive into how international conflict can become this finely tuned tool for domestic political control, providing real ammunition to entrenched elites on both sides.
It's a crucial distinction to make because political systems, especially ones built on long-term stability like the relationship between Tokyo and Beijing, they're always going to prioritize preserving their predictable framework, over spectacle or any short-term ideological posturing.
So when you introduce an uncontrollable variable, like Takeiichi.
Exactly. When you introduce someone like Takeiichi, the established mechanisms, both Japan's domestic LDP factional structure and, China's need for predictable diplomatic partners, they start to align in these really surprising ways to restore that predictability. At the end of the day, the stability of the system is the highest value.
So let's start with her, the source of this entire cascade of chaos, Prime Minister Takeiichi. Our sources, they consistently paint her as the ultimate uncontrollable variable, not just for Beijing, but for Tokyo itself.
Oh, absolutely.
She is an outsider, almost defined by her ability to bypass those traditional power structures within her own party, the Liberal Democratic Party. The international media, especially in America and Europe, they didn't hesitate to slap her with that moniker, the Japanese Trump.
And that label, when you hear it from the LDP elite themselves, it's meant as a warning sign. It signifies someone who uses nationalism, hardline rhetoric to appeal directly to a radicalized base, completely sidestepping the internal consensus building that defines LDP governance.
So it's not a single charismatic leader system?
Not at all. The LDP just doesn't operate that way. It runs on a network of faction bosses, the Habatsu, and they control everything: funding, policy, ministerial appointments, all through negotiation. Takeiichi is a direct threat to that entire structure of control. She embodies these unchecked hardline tendencies that could alienate the moderate swing voters that the LDP absolutely needs to keep its majority.
So the resistance to her wasn't really about ideological purity, it was structural self-preservation.
Absolutely. We know for a fact the establishment mounted an intense campaign against her during the 2024 party election. This wasn't some friendly rivalry.
No.
The LDP faction bosses, they were terrified of her volatility. They actively campaigned for an anybody but Takeiichi candidate.
Yeah.
Shigeru Ishiba was sort of the focus of that push for powerful leaders like Taro Aso or Toshimitsu Motegi. I mean, Stability and predictable economic ties with Asia are the lifeblood of their political power.
It's how they raise funds, how they maintain influence.
Exactly. Takeiichi's unilateral hardline approach threatened to disrupt decades of stable policy that they rely on for political capital.
And it's so critical to remember just how fragile her political position was once she actually took office. I mean, she didn't win some sweeping mandate.
Not at all.
She only got the top job in late 2025 because Shigeru Ishiba stumbled. He'd faced these significant electoral defeats, losing the ruling coalition's majority in the upper house. So she inherited this profoundly weakened position, and she was already isolated from the very factional consensus she needed to govern.
And that isolation was immediate and it was profound. The clearest sign wasn't something from the outside. It was the swift collapse of her coalition with the moderate Komeito Party in October 2025. That was just weeks after she took power.
And Komeito is essential, isn't it?
It's the whole game. It's the peace-oriented, Buddhist-backed junior partner that provides the moderate ballast and, more importantly, guarantees LDP majorities. Losing Komeito was a parliamentary catastrophe for her.
And the specific reason their president, Tetsuo Saito, gave for pulling out is really telling.
Oh, it connects directly to the establishment's isolation strategy. Saito explicitly blamed differences in fundamental stances regarding political funds and Takeiichi's handling of corruption scandals.
So it wasn't about Taiwan. It was about internal financial discipline.
Precisely. It shows the establishment, the deep state, the bureaucrats, the faction bosses, was already using internal administrative and ethical pressure to box her in. They were laying the groundwork for her eventual collapse long before Beijing ever got involved with its economic weapons. Takeiichi was already politically alone and incredibly vulnerable when she decided to challenge China directly.
And what does she do in that isolated, fragile position? Instead of, shoring up internal support, she doubles down on an external enemy. In November 2025, she gets up in the Diet and delivers this highly destabilizing speech, declaring that a Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan could be a survival-threatening situation for Japan.
The tactical goal of that statement, given her domestic mess, was probably twofold. First, to excite her nationalist base, and second, to use this external fight to distract from her internal political weakness and the corruption scandals that were swirling.
But the diplomatic cost?
It was exorbitant. That statement effectively overturned Japan's long-held policy of strategic ambiguity on Taiwan. For decades, Tokyo has been deliberately vague about how it would respond militarily. That managed uncertainty kept things stable with China. Takeiichi just threw that all away, signaling massive unpredictability to Beijing.
And that has real implications for constitutional law, doesn't it?
It goes right to the heart of it. Under Japan's current defense doctrine, military action supporting an ally can only happen if it's a survival-threatening situation that directly and fundamentally imperils Japan's existence.
So she was pre-authorizing it, in a sense.
Yes. By preemptively labeling a Taiwan blockade as such, she was trying to give the self-defense forces a potential legal basis for collective self-defense without the usual complex consensus-building process. This wasn't just talk. It was a unilateral attempt to shift the entire nation's security posture.
And China noticed.
Of course. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian publicly demanded a clear explanation from Tokyo and a retraction of these erroneous remarks. They immediately recognized the fundamental shift Takeiichi was trying to force.
So we have a leader who is politically weak, structurally isolated by her own party, and who has just deliberately injected maximum unpredictability into the regional security framework. What does Beijing actually seek in a partner, even a rival across the water?
One thing above all else: stability, predictability, and a leader who, adheres to the unwritten diplomatic rules and respects historical policy frameworks. Their entire long-term planning model, which we can get into, relies on predictable interactions and rational state-to-state exchanges.
And Takeiichi is the opposite of that.
She is the absolute antithesis of this requirement. Her hardline nationalism, her willingness to just upend decades of carefully managed ambiguity. It's seen as a direct threat, not just to China's regional goals, but to the stability of the entire Asian order that makes their economic strategy possible. A hot-headed populist who forces their hand is a major risk, and that risk has to be neutralized to preserve the existing structure.
That brings us right to part two. Why is stability such a sacred, critical element, particularly for Beijing? China's entire foundational strategy is rooted in this systematic long-term planning, right? It defines a policy continuity that spans decades, not just one leader's term.
It's fundamental to their political model. Their whole approach is defined by a consistent long-term strategy, and this process of continuous iterative reform guided by instruments like the five-year plans.
The famous five-year plans.
Right. And this practice of ensuring policy continuity while maintaining stability and then deepening reform within that continuity is what allows Beijing to form these very clear and stable expectations in its long-term development. This is what they credit, domestically and internationally, with achieving the two miracles of rapid economic development and long-term social stability over the past 70 years.
And that focus on stability translates directly into international recognition. When you look at global surveys on perceptions of China, foreign respondents consistently have a pretty objective and positive view of these five-year plans. They agree that this kind of systematic planning is a critical mechanism that ensures clear, stable expectations.
Which is vital if you're a company planning a huge capital investment in China.
Exactly.
That systematic planning creates a kind of chain reaction. Continuity begets stability, stability begets predictability, and predictability, crucially, begets the trust you need for massive long-term foreign direct investment. And this approach is recognized globally. Concepts that come from this, like building a community with a shared future for humanity, they actually get strong global approval because they signal a commitment to stable governance. It's a promise that sudden policy changes or an unpredictable leader won't just upend the established economic flow.
So this deep, inherent commitment to planning requires predictable partners. When China looks at Takeiichi, they see the opposite. Foreign Minister Wang Yi made this demand for predictability explicit when he urged Japan to view China objectively and strictly uphold the political foundation of the relationship.
And that political foundation is the absolute bedrock. Takeiichi's remarks were a direct assault on it. We're talking about the 4 legally binding political documents signed between 1972 and 2008. These aren't just symbolic agreements. They are the architectural blueprints for the entire relationship.
Okay, let's spend a minute on these. What are the key principles in these documents that Takeiichi's rhetoric is, specifically violating?
Well, the foundational one is the 1972 China-Japan Joint Statement, which normalized relations. In it, Japan acknowledged and respected China's position that there is one China and that Taiwan is an inalienable part of its territory. That settled the issue of Japan's post-war responsibility and established political non-interference.
Okay, so that's the base layer.
Right. Then the 1978 Treaty of Peace and Friendship reinforced that and set up long-term economic cooperation. Later documents in 1998 and 2008 reaffirmed that they are partners, not threats, committing both nations to deepen economic ties. Takeiichi's statement declaring Taiwan a survival-threatening situation is seen in Beijing as deliberately trying to obscure the historical facts around the Taiwan question and erode that spirit of non-interference from 1972.
And Wang Yi's language on this was very strong.
Incredibly strong. He stressed these agreements must be strictly upheld without ambiguity or aggression because any distortion fundamentally erodes trust and threatens the entire post-war Asia-Pacific order.
So it sounds like Beijing views Takeiichi as threatening the whole legal and political basis that allows their economy to even function.
Absolutely. Adherence to the One China principle is described as the political and legal foundation of their relationship. It's crucial for maintaining mutual trust. From Beijing's perspective, Takeiichi's unpredictability forces them into a reactive political posture, like the seafood ban, which in itself risks disrupting their carefully managed stability narrative. They don't want to be forced into conflict by an unstable Japanese leader.
So if the politics are defined by these essential, delicate guardrails, the economics have been defined by this incredible, almost unbelievable level of entanglement, this idea of cold politics, hot economics.
That term is perfect because it really describes the enduring paradox here. Since normalization in 1972, bilateral trade has surged over 300-fold. This massive economic activity has consistently been around $300 billion annually for the past 15 years. Cumulative two-way investment is nearly $140 billion.
These aren't just big numbers.
No, they represent deeply interwoven supply chains, especially in things like auto parts, high-precision electronics, and machinery. Major Japanese firms simply cannot decouple from China without incurring massive, potentially fatal costs.
And the high-level dialogue in early 2025 just confirms this reliance. They held the 6th China-Japan high-level economic dialogue, the first in 6 years, and came out with 20 key points of consensus. This seems like a deliberate effort by the establishment on both sides to signal stability right before Takeiichi's rise.
And those 20 points were extremely ambitious. They were focused on building structural frameworks for the future, not just fixing immediate problems. We're talking massive undertakings like expanding collaboration in third-party markets under the Belt and Road framework, which gives Japanese firms access to global infrastructure projects.
Right.
They focused on strengthening supply chain cooperation, which means basically codifying stability into component sourcing.
Yeah.
And critically, they promoted the silver economy, cooperating on solutions for their shared aging populations, and committed to speeding up negotiations for a China-Japan ROK free trade agreement. This entire dialogue was about cementing predictable, long-term, regional economic control, completely overriding any short-term political squabbles.
From the perspective of the policymakers who drafted those 20 points, Takeiichi's sudden lurch toward Taiwan must have felt like a rogue missile aimed at the foundation of their life's work.
It was seen as a betrayal of economic necessity. I mean, officials emphasize that China and Japan are partners, not rivals, and they offer opportunities for each other, not threats. Strengthening these ties is explicitly seen as a necessary measure to mitigate global uncertainties like rising protectionism or a sluggish global economy.
So the Japanese economic establishment sees China's development as a good thing.
Objectively, yes. They view it as offering significant, predictable opportunities. And Takeiichi, the populist who preaches nationalism over economic necessity, is the direct threat to this entire structure of rational, profitable statecraft.
So if China's entire system is built on predictability, and they rely on the stability of the Japanese establishment like the Aso and Motegi factions to maintain that $300 billion trade flow, what happens when an unpredictable element like Takeiichi threatens it? They have to react. But how does that reaction ultimately serve the stability they seek?
And that's where the Pincer Movement thesis becomes really compelling.
Right. So we have this history of predictable stability that's suddenly threatened by an isolated, unpredictable populist leader in Tokyo. And Beijing's reaction, which looks like pure conflict on the surface, is actually calculated to maximize domestic pressure on Takeiichi,
thereby serving the interests of the stable, entrenched Japanese establishment.
Following Takeiichi's aggressive November 2025 remarks on Taiwan, Beijing implemented these highly visible punitive actions. Let's break down the specifics, because their targeting is crucial to understanding this pincer movement.
They were swift, precise, and calibrated to inflict financial pain on very specific sectors that matter to the LDP's internal power brokers. First, Beijing reinstated a total ban on all Japanese seafood imports. This is a massive economic weapon.
It's not a small thing.
No, it primarily targets high-value exports like Hokkaido scallops, abalone, and tuna. And this move is significant because it allows the LDP establishment to immediately point to visible, measurable, and highly localized economic damage. Areas that depend on these exports, often coastal, rural districts that are LDP strongholds, suddenly face financial ruin because of Takeiichi's rhetoric.
So the economic pain immediately translates into internal political dissent, and it's aimed not at Beijing, but at Takeiichi.
Exactly. When a local LDP representative from Hokkaido has to face angry fishermen and seafood processors, their immediate political imperative is to neutralize the source of the problem, which is Takeiichi.
Okay, I know.
Second, Beijing issued a travel advisory. This led to the cancellation of hundreds of thousands of plane tickets, which hits Japan's tourism sector hard. Major business centers, retail conglomerates, they rely on that predictable flow of wealthy Chinese tourists. They suffer. And this creates a powerful, unified voice among the Japanese business lobby against Takeiichi.
And then there's the diplomatic pressure.
Right. And finally, you have the high-level diplomatic criticism from Foreign Minister Wang Yi demanding a retraction of her erroneous remarks and publicly calling her statements shocking.
The genius of this maneuver is that it doesn't even need to be consciously coordinated. Beijing is just reacting in a way that preserves their stability, and the Japanese establishment is simultaneously capitalizing on that external pressure to preserve their stability.
That is the core insight. The external pressure validates the LDP old guard's initial fears. They can leverage this chaos by saying, look, her reckless approach, her hardline nationalism, it directly threatens the $300 billion annual trade relationship. We told you she was a liability.
It gives them ammunition.
Concrete, measurable economic ammunition for the anybody but Takeiichi faction. It strengthens the hand of the rational pro-stability factions like Aso and Motegi.
And this external pressure is running parallel to the internal pressure we talked about. The leaks, the scandals. They intensified immediately following the Taiwan speech. That seems far from coincidental.
The timing is highly suspicious. Takeiichi's government was already reeling from the Komeito withdrawal in October, which cited corruption. Then, suddenly, Japanese media outlets expose fresh irregularities in her political funding. These are stories that her factional rivals would have been sitting on, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy.
Right.
The criminal complaint filed against her back in December 2024 by a law professor alleging violations of political funds control laws was resurrected and given prime placement in the news. This combination, economic sanctions from the outside, administrative scrutiny from the inside, it creates a textbook pincer movement designed to contain and eventually neutralize her through engineered isolation and public shame.
This entire dynamic really hinges on that paradox we mentioned: cold politics, hot economics. These firms must have an incredibly high tolerance for political turbulence to persist, and historically they do.
The historical context is essential here because it shows the resilience of the economic relationship against even extreme political headwinds. Japanese firms persisted through the severe anti-Japanese riots in 2005, the 2010 fishing boat collision, and the massive crisis after the 2012 nationalization of the Senkaku-ryu Islands.
And that 2012 incident caused real measurable damage.
Oh yeah, immediate financial losses. Estimates suggest a 10 billion yen loss to Japanese companies in auto and retail alone from shutdowns and supply chain disruptions. And yet the aggregate economic relationship just continued to expand in the following years.
So how do firms facing this level of what you call political conflict risk manage to stay the course? It doesn't seem like they rely on the Japanese state to fix the problem for them.
No, in this specific context, they view the state as part of the risk, not the solution. They adopt their own firm-level strategies to manage the risk, deliberately minimizing involvement from the Japanese government to avoid that political association that might make them a nationalist target.
So what do?
They view the risk as erratic, too complex to map out, so they become active political actors themselves in China. They use strategies to either transform the political environment through cultural exchange and CSR, or to hedge against current risk through supply chain diversification.
And this brings us to the crucial role of the Chinese state in managing the fallout of its own punitive actions. If Beijing is going to launch this political theater against Takeiichi, they have to make sure the theater doesn't turn into a real catastrophe for the Japanese businesses they rely on for capital and technology.
And what's fascinating here is the precise mechanism the Chinese state uses to provide this security blanket for long-term Japanese investment. During periods of high tension, security forces, specifically city-level Ministry of Public Security personnel, will contact Japanese business organizations and often even small firms in rural areas to warn them of planned protests.
So wait, the Chinese state intentionally preempts its own domestic unrest. Why would they do that?
This controlled intervention achieves two critical stabilizing goals. First, it ensures the physical safety of Japanese expatriates and their families. Japanese officials consistently say a physical threat to personnel would be the one thing that would trigger a mass withdrawal. So the Chinese state actively prevents that.
And the second goal?
Second, and more importantly for the elites in both Tokyo and Beijing, by providing specific dates, times, and sometimes even the controlled routes of protests, the Chinese state reinforces the interpretation that these anti-Japanese protests are state-controlled political theater.
So it's not uncontrollable popular rage, it's a managed pressure valve. That interpretation must assuage the firm's deepest fears.
It creates a predictable environment even within the conflict. It separates the political rhetoric, which Beijing needs to push back against Takeiichi, from the economic reality. The CCP sends a very clear signal that they will not let political theater undermine the stable economic foundation. This deliberate state management of social unrest helps maintain that predictable business environment required for hot economics to continue, even when cold politics are at their peak. It is an essential part of the strategic cooperation.
So, in a way, Beijing agrees to only punish Takeiichi's political interests, not the structural interests of the Japanese economic establishment.
That's the deal.
The idea that these firms have to be active political actors in China is highly sophisticated. Let's focus on that long-term strategy they use to transform the risk environment, specifically through corporate social responsibility, or CSR.
Right. And for Japanese multinationals, CSR in China is fundamentally not a philanthropic endeavor. It is a strategic tool for political risk management. The goal is social transformation influencing Chinese public attitudes over the long term to ensure a safer operating environment for future generations.
So initially, CSR was just about making the company look good.
Exactly. Initially, activities were often firm-promoting, focused on local philanthropy or environmental stuff to burnish an individual company's reputation. But after intense conflicts like the 2005 riots, the strategy shifted dramatically.
To what?
To country-promoting activities. They recognized that the core problem wasn't the reputation of one firm, but the deep-seated political hostility toward Japan as a whole.
So what did that look like in practice?
It involved massive coordinated resource deployment into cultural and educational exchanges. The Japan Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Beijing, acting for hundreds of member companies, launched this major program with the explicit goal of countering anti-Japanese sentiment. It was called Experienced Japanese Companies Come Close to Japan.
So this is basically corporate-funded public diplomacy.
Pretty much. Over 100 Japanese corporations poured money into hosting Chinese students and young professionals, exposing them to the best of Japanese technology, service ethics, and culture.
This sounds less like CSR and more like a deliberate, funded diplomatic effort. What was the timeline that we're working toward?
And this is where the ambition is just astonishing, and it really underscores the long-term focus on stability. The organizers explicitly targeted a transformation of Chinese attitude over a full generation. We are talking about a 30-year horizon.
30 years.
30 years. They recognized that the deeply entrenched negative beliefs about Japan's militaristic past, which are fueled by domestic political rhetoric, could only be countered by sustained, positive, grassroots exposure across multiple generations of Chinese citizens. And the firms that were most exposed to risk, the ones directly targeted in the 2005 riots, were the ones contributing most heavily.
Which proves that the direct experience with conflict activates this deep sense of strategic danger, leading them to invest not just in profit, but in political stability itself.
Exactly. And this immense commitment to managing political risk internally through social engineering is why these firms generally minimize their involvement with the Japanese state in their daily China operations. They see state association as adding risk, not mitigating it.
In the domestic Chinese context, being associated with the Japanese government just makes you a political target.
Right. But there are exceptions that prove the rule. When a geopolitical risk becomes so acute and so external that it cannot possibly be managed socially, that's when it forces the business community and the Japanese state to collaborate, ironically, to maintain the economic relationship with China.
And the classic defining example of this forced partnership is the 2010 rare earth resource dispute.
Precisely. In 2010, after the collision between a Chinese fishing boat and Japanese patrol vessels near the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands, Beijing imposed a de facto ban on rare earth metals. These are critical minerals essential for Japanese high-tech manufacturing.
So this wasn't popular nationalism or managed protests?
No, this was a clear signal of Chinese government policy and a purely external supply risk. The risk came directly from the Chinese state, making those firm-level social strategies completely useless.
So if the threat is external, what happens?
That clear geopolitical threat forced Japanese firms to partner actively with the Japanese state, specifically the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. They couldn't rely on social capital anymore. They needed diplomatic and financial leverage. This collaboration resulted in the China plus many strategy.
Right, diversifying their supply chain.
Yes, they launched a joint public-private effort to find international supply diversification, using overseas development aid budgets, striking diplomatic deals, and investing in resource extraction in countries like Australia, Vietnam, and India. It demonstrates a critical distinction. Collaboration with the Japanese state is okay, even necessary, when the threat is geopolitical and external to the Chinese business environment. But it is strictly avoided when dealing with internal Chinese political dynamics like protests or populist backlash.
Let's pull back for a moment and consider the biggest picture here. If Japanese firms, through CSR and diversification, are constantly managing geopolitics as a long-term structural issue, what's the core role of high-level diplomacy when an element like Takeiichi introduces chaos?
The role of high-level diplomacy, those careful conversations between major world leaders, is to serve as a crucial, quiet mechanism for signaling intent and setting guardrails during acute tension. It's about maintaining overall strategic stability above the noise of day-to-day politics.
And risk professionals see this tension not as a crisis, but as a long-term issue.
Exactly. They view the Japan-China tension not as an acute crisis that ends quickly, but as a long-term structural issue that must be carefully managed.
And the volatility introduced by Takeiichi is unacceptable because it jeopardizes the predictable, professional management of that structural issue. She is forcing a structural problem to become an acute, uncontrolled crisis.
And that is why the establishment on both sides converges. The Japanese establishment needs predictable trade to maintain its factional power, and the Chinese state needs predictable partners to fulfill its decades-long economic strategy. Takeiichi threatens both of those foundational requirements at the same time. Her collapse is therefore strategically necessary for the continuity of the entire Sino-Japanese relationship framework.
So we started with a cynical chuckle of that retired diplomat who claimed that the engineered conflict was perfect. We've spent this time really digging into the mechanics of that perfection.
And I think we've seen that the core dynamic is not an uncontrollable international conflict heading towards catastrophe. Instead, what we're witnessing is the robust, synchronized defense of a stable, long-established political and economic order.
A defense that is mounted jointly by entrenched elites in both Tokyo and Beijing.
Right, who share a profound interest in maintaining predictability and are both threatened by the rise of a populist leader who destabilizes the existing framework.
So the friction generated by Beijing's strong response, the seafood ban, the travel advisory, while it appears to increase international tension, is functionally enabling the Japanese establishment to contain and potentially neutralize the unpredictable populist element in their own government.
This quiet, self-interested collaboration ensures the long-term continuation of predictable economic engagement and strategic stability. The true victory here isn't ideological at all. It is the successful preservation of the status quo.
The stability of the system is so crucial that the loudest geopolitical enemies will tacitly work together to protect it from an unpredictable internal threat.